Should we Hi, everybody. Should we wait another minute or two?
Give it till about 12:05 and then we can get
Okay,
started.
That works
sounds
for me. Oh, hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob.
A lot of great familiar faces.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Catherine. Hi, everybody else.
Bob, I haven't seen you since you got sick. How you doing?
I'm doing a lot better. Thanks so much.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Appreciate it.
The room is filling up.
Yep. Yep.
I guess we'll get started soon.
Oh, are we freezy on my end?
What is
Oh,
that?
I don't, no,
Okay.
you're good. You're good.
Okay.
Okay, so should we get going?
I
12:05?
think so. Yeah, I think so. We have a lot to cover here and people will join us. So
As they come in, they'll
That's
join.
right.
They'll join. Okay, great. Okay. All right. So, welcome everyone. My name is Catherine Canaday. Welcome to today's webinar, Families in Transition, Cultural Competency and Issue Spotting in LGBTQ plus Family Practice. Please feel free to use the chat box for any questions, and we'll have time toward the end. And Andy will be able to address them. The link for the materials Sarah has put in the chat box, and they will also be sent afterward. But if you want to link through now and take a look while the webinar is going on, feel free to do so. At the end of the session, please follow directions sent in today's email for the online attendance certificate process. Fill out the evaluation. Whether you're applying for CLE credits or not, a certificate of attendance for financial neutrals and mental health professionals will be included in the evaluation confirmation. If you have called in, please send an email to the office with the phone number you are using so your attendance can be verified. For our attending attorneys, the first code of today's program for the CLE credit is family, FAMILY, family. Melissa will be providing the rest of the codes as we go through the program. It's my pleasure today to welcome Andy Izenson to speak to us. Andy's pronouns are they, them. Andy is Senior Legal Director for Chosen Family Law Center, Inc., and partner at the family law and mediation firm Diana Adams Law and Mediation, PLLC, both based in New York City. Andy works with and advocates for LGBTQIA, polyamorous, and non traditional families, and is the clinical instructor on policy at the LGBTQ Advocacy Clinic at Harvard Law School. Andy is a thought leader on LGBTQI issues and a popular speaker who gives talks on issues including same-sex marriage, transgender and gender nonconforming youth issues, the Supreme Court and the fate of LGBTQIA Americans, cultural competency and sensitivity for attorneys and other professionals serving transgender and gender nonconforming clients, and opportunities for corporate leadership with LGBTQIA employees. It's a real treat to have you here with us today, Andy. We're so happy to have you, and we look forward to a lot of good learning today.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's really lovely to be back at NYACP. I've been uh, in and out of NYACP for a long time, and I'm really happy to be with you all and to see so many familiar and also new faces. I was just thinking, Catherine, about how long we've been friends. I think it's been like 15 years at this point.
Oh boy, I didn't count back, but it's a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so you all have the CLE or the materials that I sent out are basically a couple of um, there's a couple of academic papers in there, primarily about um, parenting, the parenting of trans young people, because I think that's the area of the relevant work that is the least well understood by most people in the field, um, about the impact on parents, or sorry, on children of having affirming or non-affirming parents. And there's a really helpful case study in there by Kuvalanka et al. That is about it's a case study of a couple of custody cases where there's a trans young person and one parent is affirming and the other is non-affirming, which is one of the things that we encounter frequently. So take a look through that at your convenience. I've found these documents very useful. There's also a document called the Trans Youth Handbook in there that I worked on with the LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic at Harvard. I do want to say we put that out about a year ago, and so some of it is very out of date now because things are changing very fast. So before you rely on any of the information in there, obviously, check with someone who is paying attention and can give you updated information, particularly around things like um, identity documents, interaction with the federal government, and so forth. So, I'll say a little bit about why I'm here, and then we'll go into here's the plan. I think you should have the timed agenda in your materials, but here's the plan for sure. We're going to start with some level setting, get a sense of who's in the room, where you're already at, make sure that I ideally tailoring what we're talking about today to the level of information that you all already have. Then we're going to spend some time talking about cultural competency generally, being kind to your trans clients, and having that intention to be kind actually come through in a meaningful way. Then we're going to talk about issue spotting. What are the types of things that tend to come up and how to keep your eyes out for them? We're going to talk about mediation and negotiation as opposed to litigation, and what are the particular issues in that question for LGBTQ plus clients. And then we're going to spend the last little bit talking about the current stuff, the state of affairs politically and in the sort of wider world, and how that impacts our clients, our community, and how we work with them. And then we've got a good long chunk for question and answers at the end. So please feel free to put them in the chat or hold them till the end. We'll talk about them all at the end. If I say any terminology in the interim that you don't understand, if there's anything that you just have like a clarifying question about, please do feel free to unmute yourself. I do want to have this feel not super formal, and I welcome folks speaking up if you need something from me in order to understand what we're talking about. All right, everyone feeling good? You ready to get started?
Yeah, Andy, do you think the volume is a little low on my end? I don't know if anyone else is experiencing that, but if you can get a little louder, it's a little, I don't know if
Yeah,
it's,
for
I don't know
sure.
if it's just me. So if it is,
You know what? The other thing I can do is switch to my other microphone.
it might just be me. I don't know.
Yeah. How's this? Is this any better?
That's better.
Okay,
That's good.
awesome.
Yeah,
That's great.
thank you.
Technology is a plague. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to do a little bit of level setting. So can you all put in the chat maybe are you a attorney? Are you a financial professional? Are you a mental health professional? How do you support clients? And we've got, oh, Barbara. We got a good mix so far. Lots of attorneys. Amazing. And so as you've been supporting clients over the course of your career, have you had a case so far that has involved trans issues? Mhm. Okay, yeah, most of you have. Okay, that's really good to know. And I will say it's possible, there's a question, have you had a trans client? And another question, have you had a client? Have you worked with trans issues in a case? They're not quite the same. Because as we'll talk about, sometimes a case involving a trans client is exactly the same as any other case. It's just that the client is also trans and you need to be culturally competent around that. And sometimes there are particular issues in the divorce or in the conflict that have to do with the trans identity of the client. So we'll talk about pulling those things apart, not over attributing, but being really specific about what's actually a trans issue and what is just a trans person having an issue. Okay, and then one more question for y'all. Thank you for indulging my little Q&A. Are there any particular burning questions that you want to make sure we touch on today? Is there anything that's really been on your mind? Anything that really moved you to come to this session today? Anything you want to make absolutely sure that we try and come away from this class having talked about? No burning questions yet. Everyone's just feeling very open. Okay. So while you all think about that, and do please feel free to drop them in the chat if anything comes to you over the course of the next little while. I also want to just briefly introduce myself. I've been working in the field of collaborative divorce as an attorney since 2012. And I have been, I transitioned around the same time, also in 2012. And so I've been navigating the overlap of those two things for about 13 years now. And it's given me a real gift, I think, for helping other practitioners, for helping my colleagues bridge that gap of understanding, because a lot of the time it's easy to distance ourselves from our clients, to think that the stuff that they're encountering and undergoing is stuff that is not something that we can really understand, we can only empathize with. And so having the perspective of being both of these things, both an attorney and a member of the marginalized group that we're serving, gives me a way of helping my colleagues understand the questions in terms that make sense to them a little bit more than just serving clients. I also, let's see, I live in the Hudson Valley of New York. I live with 3 partners and a beagle, who you will probably hear now that we've switched to my external mic. You will probably hear him talking to me at some point in the next hour and a half. And I'm really glad to be here. I have a lot of affection for NYACP. So we're going to do a little bit of necessary terminology before we dive into cultural competency, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. The first couple of terms, and I'll say also, language changes. There's a lot of motion in community and how communities use language, especially right now. Things move really fast. And so it may be that the information I'm giving you today will be out of date at some point in the future. Please don't take what I say as the final authority on really anything. But, this is my understanding as of February 28th, 2025. So one term I wanna start by making sure we're all on the same page on is cisgender. Anyone hear that term before? Can anyone tell me what it means? Go ahead and unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
I believe, hi.
Thanks for coming.
I believe it is when you're the gender that you were assigned at birth corresponds with the gender that you identify with?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Cisgender simply means not transgender. So, you know, when you're a baby, you come out, the doctor takes a look at you and goes, I think that's a X. And sometimes when you get a little older, you go, nope, that wasn't right. I am, instead of that, a Y. And sometimes when you get a little older, you go, yeah, that doctor had it about right. If the doctor had it about right, then you're cisgender. If the doctor did not have it right, then you're transgender. So another term I want to level set on is around transition, gender affirming care. And I want to just make sure that we're clear, because I think a lot of people who don't understand these concepts really deeply think of transition as an event, as something that you do and then it's done. And rather, gender affirming care is an ongoing process, right? Transition really lasts the rest of your life. And so I think it's important to remember that, because sometimes when you have a divorce client who is trans, they think of the rest of their life as something that shouldn't be affected by their transness, when in fact it's really a lifelong experience. It's not something that you do it, you have this one surgery and then you've done it, you've transed. The third one I want to make sure that we're just clear on, this is pretty simple, is the distinction between a trans man and a trans woman, because I think sometimes people have this backwards. So a trans man, I think sometimes people think of, they use the term trans man to mean someone that they thought was a man that is now no longer a man. It's actually the opposite of that. So a trans man is someone who is a man, self-identifies as a man, regardless of, having been assigned female at birth. And a trans woman is someone who is a woman, understands herself to be a woman, notwithstanding having been assigned male at birth. So the easy way to remember this is just the word that you use is the word that is true for someone now, not in the past, right? And that's true not just with trans stuff, but anything. If I made a career shift and I stopped being an attorney and I became I went and worked at Petco, which is honestly my greatest dream. I just gave dogs baths all day. If you asked, what does Andy do for work? The answer would be Andy gives dogs baths. That's what's true for me now, not Andy's an attorney, which used to be true, right? So you're describing people in a way that's true for them today. So that's the easiest way, I think, to remember whether you use trans man or trans woman in this way or that way. Just use the language that's true for them today. And then the final thing I just wanna get a little sense of where everyone's at on is around like gender neutral pronouns, singular they, non-binary trans identity. Are we feeling more or less confident about that? Do we feel like we need to have a little primer? Little primer? Yeah, okay, I'm seeing some nods. Okay, so the basic idea is this. Think about your own gender for a moment, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, whether you're something else. Think about how you feel your gender. So if you're a woman, how do you know you're a woman? What does being a woman mean to you? And when you imagine someone telling you that you aren't a woman, how does that feel? What is the defense against that? And when you think about your gender, you often will think about it in opposition to a gender that you're not. So if you're a woman, how do you know that you're not a man? What does the idea of being not a man feel like to you? How can you tell? What is it? How do you experience that in your body? So this is the same experience that a trans person has, right? That, a trans woman would feel that she knows she's a woman, she knows she's not a man, and she feels that in her body the same way you do. And for someone who is non-binary or genderqueer or otherwise in a third gender category, you simply have that not a man feeling, sensation about both manness and womanness, right? You're like, I know I'm not a man. They know they're not a man in the same way that you know you're not a man, but they also know they're not a woman in that same way. And so it is either, somewhere in between, it is somewhere outside of the binary. Different people think about it different ways, but the general idea is you're not a man. You're also not a woman. You're something else. And I think a lot of people who have not had a lot of time to practice with singular they pronouns have a really hard time with it because, you think, well, they should be a plural, right? They should be multiple people. How can I use that for one person? I have terrific news for you. You actually use the singular they all the time. You just don't think about it. And so it's not a question of learning to do something new. It's a question of bringing something that's unconscious into your consciousness. So for example, let's say you're at a conference. I don't know about you. I go to conferences all the time. I love to stay in hotels. Sometimes they have hot tubs. It's the best. So you're at a conference, right? You're at the hotel. You're in the hotel bar. You're having a drink with your friends, and you see a cell phone sitting on the bar, and you're like, oh no, someone lost their cell phone. So you take the cell phone, you bring it to the front desk, and you say, somebody lost their cell phone. Can I leave it here for them? And hopefully they'll come here to pick it up. Now, this is not multiple people's cell phone, right? You know that. This belongs to one person, but you don't know who that person is. And so because you can't identify that they are a man or a woman, you use the singular they. So you already do this all the time. It's just a question of bringing that into your conscious mind so that you can do it on purpose instead of just reflexively. Does that make sense? Awesome. Okay. So before we move into cultural competency, are there any questions about anything that we've hit so far?
Not on my end, Andy, but I did want to offer the second code for the program today, which is February. If you're going to make me spell it, I can, but
I can spell it.
okay.
I think at this point, either we've learned how to spell February, or we're just not gonna.
I think I'm the latter. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah, that's me with time zones. I'm like, I'm 37 years old. At this point, I just need to accept that I'm not gonna learn. I'm not gonna figure out time zones. It's not gonna happen. Okay, so let's talk about how to make your office and your virtual office a welcoming place for your LGBTQ clients. So the first thing to do is to be conscious of what role you are putting your client in with regards to your relationship. So a lot of the time, I think professionals will take the opportunity of having a queer or trans client. They'll take it as a learning opportunity. They're like, oh, good, this is the time when I can learn from you about how to serve your community, about what your community needs. And if you personally are in any kind of marginalized population, even if you're like a woman, you may have encountered this yourself, that you're working with a new doctor and they're like, oh, this is my opportunity to learn about women's issues. They're trying to learn for themselves on you. And I think it's really important to make sure that you're not doing that, right? That you're taking responsibility for learning this stuff in ways other than on your clients, because it's not kind, right? They're paying you to be a guinea pig. We don't like to make people do that. The good news is, for the 20 something of you that are in here, you've already made the decision to do that. And I know that because you're in this Zoom with me. So good job. You already did step one, which is taking responsibility for educating yourself and not just educating yourself on your client. But I have a client that I'm working with where right now I'm mediating with a hospital that the client was in was in mental health inpatient for about a week. And while he was there, and the client is trans, while he was there, all of the clinicians that were trying to help him with his mental health crisis, or that were supposed to be trying to help him with his mental health crisis, were saying, this is going to be, to him, this is going to be so good for us to learn from you. while he's trying to get emergency medical care. And this is really damaging, right? It's damaging to the trust, the professional relationship, because they're supposed to be helping him. They're supposed to be caring for him. They're not supposed to be learning off of him. So as we are deciding that we want to make a welcoming space for our LGBTQ clients in our office, I think there's two things to keep in mind. The first is about letting the client know that this is a welcoming space for them. And the second is about actually showing up and being a welcoming space for them. And those two things are actually not, they're actually different. And so there are things like hanging a rainbow flag in your physical office, saying in your footer of your email that your office is a welcoming space for LGBTQ plus clients, stuff like that, where you're communicating explicitly, this is a space that welcomes LGBTQ plus clients. And then on top of that, there's also stuff that you got to do to make your office actually be welcoming. So one example is, the statement of net worth form that the court promulgates that clients have to submit, or sometimes clients have to submit for divorces. The court form has husband and wife on it. And so when I send, if I send the form that says husband and wife on it to clients, if they're not husband and wife, that says to those clients, oh, this office is not a welcoming place for me. This practitioner is not taking into account the ways in which my family looks different from the legal and cultural norm. So thinking about just keeping in mind the assumptions that are being made in all of the court forms, in all of the forms for your office, in all of the procedures, thinking about what assumptions are being made and what does it mean to someone who does not meet those assumptions to have those assumptions put on them. So when I think about the assumptions that are being made in my intake forms, for example, you can think about that even just in the wording of the questions. So when you have a question, for example, about children of the marriage, if you don't ask about the provenance of the children, about how they came to be, and about whether the legal parentage for both parents of those children is stable and secure, you are making an assumption about how those children came to be and about the parentage relationships for those parents. When you're working with LGBTQ plus clients, it's really important to ask questions about how did this child come to be and what is the legal parentage situation, because that's something that often comes up in LGBTQ plus family mediation. And so asking questions like, is there a gamete donor involved in this child's life? Is this child biologically related to one or both parents? When I do intake interviews with clients, I usually ask the question in an open-ended way. I say, tell me about your child. How did they come into your life? And then we follow up. What does your legal relationships within the family look like? How did you do them? Did you do a second parent adoption? Is anyone legally married? Is anyone domestic partnered? What is it? How did you do it? What does it look like? So in intake interviews, I usually try to have those questions be open-ended because that's the best way to avoid having assumptions embedded in the questions, rather than asking, so is your sperm donor known or anonymous? I would ask, tell me about how your child came to be. And that usually lets clients know, I know that there's a wide variety of answers to this question, and I am not making an assumption about what your answer is. So I want to ask you all, can you think of an example for this? So let's say you wanted to get the information of whether your client's relationship preceded their ability to legally marry. because that's something that often comes up for same-sex couples if they've been together for a long time. When you want to identify the start date of the accrual of marital property, you know, if they could only get married in 2015, but they've been together since 1992, how do you then take into account the equity of them, of, you know, they would have been accruing marital property all that time if they could have, but they only became able to marry, you know, very late into the relationship. How would you ask that question? Yeah, Kristen.
Hi again. I guess something like, despite the date of your legal marriage, when would you consider the date that you started a partnership with one another?
Yeah, when do you consider the date that you started your partnership? I like that. I might ask them as two questions also. So what is the date of your legal marriage, and what is the date that you started your partnership? And they might not agree on that, which is often one of the things that we fight about. You know, because if one of them thinks, if the date being, you know, in 1992 or 1993 makes the difference between whether we have to divide ownership of the condo or not, you know, then it's financially in someone's best interest to have it be later or earlier. Anyone else have an idea? This is also a place where you can use very open-ended questions to evoke sort of friendly and tender feelings at the beginning of the mediation, right? So for example, I often will ask folks to start by telling me their story. Tell me the story of your relationship, the story of your marriage. And often, especially if it's a custody matter, I'll start by asking them, tell me about your child. How did they come into your life? What are they like? What do they like to do? What is your relationships with them like? Asking questions about the child that aren't relevant in terms of content, but are relevant in terms of keeping the focus of both parents firmly on the best interests of the child rather than on fighting with each other. Any other ideas? So the other thing I want you to keep in mind is about making your physical office a welcoming place for your clients. And one thing to keep in mind on that is the bugbear bathrooms. One thing that I have encountered is that, especially for people who are in offices where the bathroom is like down the hall, you know, I think we have a lot of colleagues in ACP whose offices you have to get the key from the front desk person and go to the office. Every time I'm in an office like that and I ask for the bathroom key, I see the front desk person have a crisis about like, which key do I give you? It's very funny. And so I often, you know, I would recommend when you are training up your front desk people to let them know, like, we have LGBTQ clients, we have trans clients. If you can't tell what gender someone is by looking, and honestly, even if you can, you can, if someone asks you for the bathroom key, you can say, here's the men's key and here's the women's key. Take whichever one is right for you, or something like that. Or ask them, which would you prefer? You know, it's a difficult question to ask sensitively, and it can feel awkward. But you can also, like, you can just know this is not the first time this has happened to someone. You know, at this point, I think it's funny. I'm like, yeah, sweat. But your front desk person will not be the first person to ask a question like this of your client. And so the only thing that's important is to do it in a way that's kind, and sensitive and loving. So I would also suggest when you think about your intake forms that you take a couple of extra things into account that may not already be on there. So for example, your client may go by a different name than their ID says. So I suggest having a space on your intake form for name of use and a space for legal name because they may be different. And there may also be a discrepancy between what their gender is and what gender marker is on their ID. So you can also put a space for that. I also recommend putting a space for pronouns, just so that you know what pronouns to use when, for example, drafting your marital settlements agreements. I have never found any problem with putting singular they in marital settlement agreements. So, you don't have to worry too much about using whatever pronoun they put. And, when thinking about what questions to be asking, I think it's really helpful to, before you ask any question or before you put any question in your intake, to start by asking yourself, why do I need to know this? Because this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like satisfying your curiosity on your client or through your client, or using your client as a learning opportunity, which we're trying not to do. That you may find yourself tempted to ask stuff that you don't actually need to know because you're curious. And so stop, ask yourself, why do I need to know this? And if the answer does not have to do with their divorce, skip it. So for example, you may find yourself wanting to know if your trans client has had the surgery. Does that matter for their divorce? I would say it doesn't. I think the only reason I could see it mattering for their divorce is if there's a question of, waiting to disentangle their health insurance in advance of or until after a planned surgery has occurred. But when you think about this is the really common thing, right? Is a sort of curiosity about a trans body. Make sure that you're being really thoughtful of how much of that you're actually putting on your client, because that's a really easy way to break trust with your client. The last thing to remember around cultural competency is about safety planning. So I try and keep an eye on what situations might put my client at more risk than me, or at risk that I don't personally experience, so that I can be thoughtful with them about that. So one example is if I'm going to court with a client. So for example, if you do end up having to do a preliminary conference or something and you go to court, if the client hasn't spent time at court before, they may not know that you have to go through security to get into the court. They may not know that you sometimes have to get patted down before you go into a court. And this is something, of course, that a person with a gender nonconforming body is going to experience more than a cisgender person. Is they're going to be subject to more scrutiny, more suspicion. They're going to have their identity documents looked at. And if their identity documents don't match what they look like or what the person looking at them thinks they should look like based on the document, they're going to run into more trouble. So having an understanding of that and doing safety planning with your client about that in advance, number one, helps you know what to do. And number two, lets your client know not only does this person care what happens to me, but they understand the situation that I'm in. Right? Because you have to remember that most LGBT people, when they go into a situation with the court or with any kind of agency or with the state, they know they're embattled, right? They know that they're under threat. And you can either be part of the system that is threatening them, or you can be on their side in the battle. And I think what you have decided to do by virtue of being at this session, I think that you've all decided that you want to be on your client's side in that fight. And so deciding that is the first step. The second step is figuring out what you need your weapons to be in order to really fight for your client. Now, before we move to issue spotting, which is, we're just going to talk a little bit about the actual law. I just want to give you a quick little process on what happens when you screw up. You call your client the wrong name, the wrong pronoun, something like that. You use gendered language that's not right. You give them the wrong bathroom key. You do something that hurts your client's feelings, right? That damages your trust with your client. I have a really easy 5-step process for how to screw up. All right. Step number 1, take a deep breath. Don't panic. Actually, let's do that right now. When you do something that hurts somebody that you care about, it hurts. It feels really bad. That's good. That means that you're a kind and compassionate person. But in the moment, it's really easy to panic and be like, what can I do to make this better? And just throw everything at it instead of being targeted and thoughtful. So step number 1 is breathe. Don't panic. Step number 2 is correct yourself. You're not going to apologize first. You're going to correct yourself and then apologize. The reason for that is so that when your brain is making this new connection and reinforcing it, the connection that you're making is about this is the right answer, not about I screwed up. So you're going to breathe, you're going to correct yourself, and then you're going to apologize. So let's say you call your client, you call me the wrong name. You're going to stop, you're going to take a breath. You're going to say, Andy, excuse me, Andy, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, not I'm sorry, they, right? That helps you learn in a way that's not just about torturing yourself. And then step number 4, don't apologize more than twice. You apologize once, it's reflexive. You apologize twice, you're letting them know, actually, that this means something to me. Like I do care about this. Once you get to number 3, you're just haranguing them to say, don't worry about it. And so, the more you make like an oversized deal out of it, eventually it gets to the point where it's about your feelings and not theirs. So remember, this happens constantly. So correct yourself, apologize, commit to doing better, and then move on. So, especially when it comes to language stuff, things like pronouns, things like names, you're being asked to do 2 new things at once, right? You're being asked to do something consciously that you usually do unconsciously, and you're being asked to use that language in a way that may feel counterintuitive to you, that may be different than what you would automatically do. The good news is that the first one of those things gets easier with practice, and the second one gets easier as you get better at the first one. So just keep practicing. Just don't beat yourself up. Just remember that the reason that it feels bad is because you are a compassionate person that wants to be good to your client, and that's a good thing. It's not a reason to torture yourself. And just keep practicing, and keep trying. And also you can practice using the singular they as an example in the rest of your life, because most cis people won't notice, and it will make it a little easier if you have it more fluently in your conversation. All right, let's move to a little bit of issue spotting. Are there any questions about anything we've addressed so far before we move on?
So, I can give the 3rd code. I don't know if it's too early or too late. I don't know. So I'll just do it because we have and it's culture, and that's I can't spell it, but maybe Catherine will do it for me. So
Yes, I'll write it. I'll even write it.
thank you.
It's Friday. You shouldn't be expected to spell anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Lori.
Hi, yes. Quick question. Are certain titles inappropriate? Like, for example, if somebody identifies as a woman to have that person be called husband, or somebody identifies as a man, wife.
Yeah, absolutely. So I usually try and have if we're talking about divorce and so their marital status is important, I usually just say spouse for everybody. because even, they're legally interchangeable, right? There's no legal difference between a husband and a wife. And so you don't need to have those things gender marked. And so, that's just an example. That's a really good example of what are the places where your paperwork is making assumptions, right? One assumption that a lot of paperwork around divorce makes is that a marriage is a man person married to a woman person. And when we're trying to strip those assumptions out of our work so that we can serve a broader set of families, that's a really good one. Because, when we start pulling these assumptions out, one of the things that you'll notice is like, why do we actually need this? Even for heterosexual couples, like, why is it necessary to say anything other than spouse? Because it doesn't make a legal difference, right? That's a great question, Lori.
Thank you. I appreciate that because I came across that and I wasn't sure.
No, you're totally right. Why do we say husband and wife? We could just say spouse. There's no legal reason.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's take a second with issue spotting. So issue spotting, I think, is a really important feature of cultural competency because it lets you know when your clients are telling you their story. It lets you know which of these things fit into the patterns that tend to happen. So you're not encountering everything for the first time. So we're going to talk about we're going to start by talking about trans clients divorcing and queer LGBTQ clients divorcing. We're going to talk about parentage. We're also going to talk about domestic violence. We're going to talk about something that's been coming up a lot lately, which is working with clients who are not themselves necessarily LGBTQ, but who have an LGBTQ child and that the custody of that child is an issue. And then finally, we're going to talk about the specific circumstance of people divorcing because of transition. We're just going to touch on that because it is something that sometimes comes up. So there's a couple of issues that tend to come up with LGBTQ clients divorcing. One is around the duration of the marriage. We mentioned this in a hypo earlier, but knowing that your clients may not have been able to be legally married for the entire time that they would have been. Most clients that have been together for a long time, their marriage date is 2015 because that's when it became legal. And so you want to think about in your intake, making sure that you're clear on not just what is the date of the marriage, but not assuming that the date of the marriage is the date that the financial entanglement began. And so remembering that one of the things you may have to work out between the clients is what is the actual date that we understand our financial entanglement to begin and to end. You also want to think about, do we want to apply the rules of marriage to this time between when we got together and when we actually got married? Or do we want to do a different thing? Because people, I always tell clients, you can agree to whatever you can agree to. And so you don't have to identify the actual date of the beginning of the financial entanglement and then treat them as having been married for that entire time. That's one option, but it's not the only option. And I always like to give my clients as much elbow room as possible to do it in the way that works for their family. And so not assuming that the way the state would do it is the right way, but just laying out the options for them. The other thing that often comes up for LGBT families, for LGBT parents, is the question of parentage. Now, if clients are in a collaborative process, chances are good that they are not trying to mess with each other. But one thing to remember is that there is a very common way that same-sex parents will mess with each other. And this is so common, in fact, that in the LGBT Bar Association's Family Law Institute, there's a nickname for this type of case. It's called an LBB case, lesbians behaving badly. What happens is you'll have two parents. One is genetically and biologically related to the child, and the other is not. Now, in New York, If they're married to each other, the non-bio parent, the non-bio mom, let's say we've got a pair of lesbians, because that's the most common version of this. You've got your non-bio mom who is married to the birth mom. And in New York, the marriage between them infers parentage rights on non-bio mom. So if you're in New York, if you're married to someone who gives birth to a child, you are legally presumed to be the other parent of that child. Cool, easy, no problem. The trouble is, if you don't have a confirmatory process, a second parent adoption or an order of parentage, you are subject to state law. So let's say bio mom takes the child and leaves the state, tries to get either UCCJEA or PKPA jurisdiction for the divorce in a state that has hostile and homophobic laws. Those hostile and homophobic laws will often include not recognizing the parentage of the non-bio parent if you don't have a confirmatory process, a confirmatory adoption or judgment of parentage. So when bio mom pulls rank, says, I'm the real mom, you're not the real mom, and takes the child and goes to Florida, goes to Texas, goes to Tennessee, that's what we call in the biz an LBB case. That's lesbians behaving badly. So keep your eye out for the understanding that your bio mom has this access of power until and unless the second parent adoption is complete, or the order of parentage. I've had a good number of clients who will go through with the parentage procedure, the adoption or order of parentage, even though the parties are divorcing, because they share an intention that both of them are parents of the child. But do keep in mind that bio mom will probably know that she that she has the ability to just run off with the child and absolutely screw non-bio mom. The other thing is that most people don't understand how parentage works. I barely understand how parentage works, and I've been doing this for a decade. It's very complicated. And when we got same-sex marriage recognized at the federal level, it turned the weird and screwy and confusing patchwork of state law and interstate statute about parentage into, when we got federally recognized marriage, it turned that patchwork into a different patchwork. So it's still this complicated and weird patchwork. It just works differently than it used to because different states have different rules about how they recognize or interpret each other's standards for parentage. So knowing that parentage can be a complicated issue, often in a collaborative process, the parties can agree, we are both parents, we both have parenting rights, and we both, we both intend to maintain the relationship between both of us and the child or children. But it's important to remember that parentage and custody are two separate questions. And before you get to the custody question, you have to do the parentage question. And a lot of clients will conflate them because they'll say, I think they're a bad parent and therefore they shouldn't be a parent. But those are two separate questions, right? Do they have standing to seek custody and visitation is a question about, the relationship between the parent and the other parent, or what legal procedures they've done to affirm that parentage. And then after that question has been answered, then you can get to the custody question, which is a best interests evaluation. Parentage is not a best interest evaluation in most cases. Is this not also a question for male fathers in a marriage where one is a sperm donor of the child, or they are each a sperm donor of different children? Absolutely. Yes. The reason that that it is less common for this problem to come up with same-sex male couples is because when you are working with same-sex male couples, they are working with a surrogate rather than a sperm donor. And there's more legal structure around working with surrogates than around working with a sperm donor. You have to be a little bit more official about it because obviously if you're not, your surrogate is a parent. So it's very common for, if you're working with a sperm donor, it's very common to just like have your buddy come over with a turkey baster. You don't do any legal process. You don't work with a doctor. You don't do any of that stuff. And you just say, it'll be fine. It's less common to have that level of informality with a surrogate, which I think is why you run into this problem less with same-sex male couples. Thanks, Marcos. The second type of issue spotting is around domestic violence. So there's two things I want to let you know around domestic violence for LGBT families. One is that there is an angle of domestic violence that LGBT families, couples have that you don't see with heterosexual couples, which is around outing and the threat of outing. That one angle of power and control is around the LGBT identity itself. Now, this can show up in, the abusive partner saying, I will tell your family that you're gay, or I will tell your family that you're trans if you don't do what I say. And it also can show up in the abusive partner telling their partner, you can't leave me because no one else will ever love you because you're trans or because you're gay. You have to stay with me because I'm the only person that would put up with what's wrong with you. So that type of narrative is something to be on the lookout for, and to remember that is a kind of abuse that's recognized as a kind of abuse, that kind of homophobic and transphobic stuff. The other thing to remember is that it's very, very common for trans women, trans people generally, but in particular trans women, to be victims of abuse who, if they seek intervention around that abuse, they get identified as the perpetrator of the abuse. This happens also often for Black women, cis Black women, that there's this sort of cultural idea that they are violent, that a trans woman is violent, is sexually violent in particular, and so if a trans woman calls the police because she is being attacked, in many cases, the police will come, they'll see a trans woman, and they'll say, oh, this person is obviously the perpetrator, and arrest the victim instead. So knowing that, I think, is really helpful in issue spotting around domestic violence when there's a trans person involved, because they will often either be misidentified as the perpetrator of domestic violence when in fact they are the victim, and that will make them less willing to, for example, file a police report when something does happen, because they know they will be not unlikely to be believed. Not that cis women tend to be believed when they file police reports about domestic violence. It's really just, it's a problem that we have in common. The third point about issue spotting is around when the child or children around which there is a custody matter are themselves queer or trans. Now, this is a very complicated matter that is increasingly complicated every day. We could do a whole 2-hour session just on this, on the UCCJEA issues, on the different types of problems that the hostile legislation in certain states are causing for parents, for children. It's terrible. It's terrible. There is a bunch of stuff in your CLE materials about this. But the important thing for you to know when working with these families is that there are resources for these. I'm thinking in particular of the Ackerman Institute, which has its Gender and Family Project. There's a couple of papers by the founder of the Gender and Family Project, Jean Malpass, in your CLE materials, which you'll, I think, find very helpful. But I think that it's really important when working with parents who are differing amounts of supportive of their LGBT child. I think it's really crucial to stay in mediation or stay in collaborative process rather than going to litigation, because the stakes with litigation are really high and fully depend on the personal stance of whatever judge you happen to get assigned to. And depending on where in the state you're practicing, those odds are not great, right? So whether the judge decides that your client is is a fit parent because they are trying to be supportive of their queer or trans child, or that they are an unfit parent because they are trying to be supportive. It really just depends on, does this judge watch Fox News or not? And that's something that we really can't control. And I always try and tell my clients, like, I don't want to take that risk. Like, this child's well-being will depend on just a throw of the dice of which judge you get. And I don't want to do that to your family. We'll talk a little bit more about mediation and negotiation versus litigation in a moment. The last issue spotting thing I want to touch on is that it's not uncommon when you have a trans or newly out as gay divorce client, that one of the issues in the divorce is the coming out or the transition. This is something that I think you may find factors more into it for the mental health professionals in the room than the legal professionals, because there's often, there's one version of it, right? That it's like, you had a couple who understood themselves to be straight. You have a straight woman whose husband is now a woman, and the wife says, well, but I'm not into women, right? I'm straight. I want to be married to a man. And so they divorce in a way that's relatively amicable, but simply because there is now an incompatibility between the gender and the sexual orientation of the two partners. In cases like that, I think it's often, in my experience, both partners are just very sad. There isn't a lot of fighting. They're both just really sad. I think the other very common thing that I see in this type of divorce is that it gets a little bit sublimated into stuff about dishonesty. So, one thing you'll see is, as somebody is exploring their own trans identity, it takes them a while to come out to the people in their life sometimes, especially if they have a sense that that person's not going to be supportive. And so you may find that a person who is exploring trans identity will do things in secret because they're not ready to communicate, or they don't feel that their partner will be supportive. So they'll go out, cross-dressing in secret, or they'll meet up with other people in secret. They'll have other relationships in secret because they're not ready to admit their transness either to themselves or to their partner. But then that secrecy ends up being the thing that damages the marriage rather than the transness itself. So it's not necessarily that there's a problem with them being a woman or them being a man, but rather that, at the time that all of the information comes out, it feels like a lot of stuff blindsiding the cisgender partner at once. Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when we're talking about assumptions, and always as mediators and also collaborative professionals, not to have assumptions, we shouldn't assume that because someone's transitioning, therefore they're getting divorced. I've had several matters, they were getting divorced for something unrelated.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, so this is what I mentioned right at the beginning about, like, sometimes it's a trans related legal issue. Sometimes it's just a trans person having a legal issue. And it's important to remember to pull those things apart. This is also something that healthcare professionals really struggle with. There's a term in the field that's trans broken arm syndrome, where if you're a trans person, you go to the doctor, you have a broken arm, and the doctor says, oh, this must have something to do with your transition. And so we try to resist having that assumption that, like, if you're having a legal problem, it must be because you're trans. Sometimes it is, but not always. It might just be that your marriage fell apart because you've grown apart as people. It might be that somebody cheated on somebody. It might be that, it might be stuff that's absolutely in line with all of the other stuff you're seeing with clients who are not queer or trans. The reason that we learn issue spotting is so that we can identify which cases and which legal issues are actually queer and trans related, so that we don't assume that they all are.
And I think looking at ourselves, and we're always checking the implicit bias and so on, to say maybe you might divorce someone if you were in that, but that doesn't mean that that's the experience for your clients. You have to really be careful about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I find it, I mean, it might just be that I only date other trans people, but it seems really crazy to me if someone comes to you and is like, hey, I've like figured out this really important thing about myself and I want to share it with you, to treat that as anything other than a beautiful gift. I don't understand it, but I don't think it's ever just that, right? In some cases like this, I have had the issue of using marital funds towards gender affirming care with the cisgender spouse seeking the credit back. Oof, I don't like that at all. I mean, if that were me, I would say, let's think about what expenses during the marriage we want to have in this bucket of like getting reimbursed for. Because if it's just the gender affirming care, that's a little rough. If we want all healthcare expenses during the entire marriage for both parties to be credited towards the settlement in both cases, like that's a weird thing to do, but sure. And so I think, that to me flags, I just want to be, I want to have nothing to do with this transition, which flags to me that that transphobia is at play. And so I would push back on that as the person representing the transitioning spouse as an unreasonable thing. Like while they're married to each other, they're sharing expenses, right? They are one legal and financial unit. They are taking care of each other. They are paying for the healthcare needs of both parties with marital money. That's what marriage means. That's what it's for. And so saying I specifically want credit back for these specific procedures, I think that's not about the money, Do I know what percentage of couples divorce upon or shortly after transition? I don't know that. I think it's a hard thing to track, because you know, the census only started asking people if they were trans in 2022, and now they've stopped again. So and I can tell you, what I see, but I'm a divorce professional, so I have a little bit of confirmation bias. So the last thing I want to spend a few minutes on is talking about mediation and negotiation versus litigation. Obviously, none of us are purely litigators. There may be some of us that also do litigation as well as collaborative practice in our practices. And I always recommend for LGBT families to try really hard to stay out of court, because you don't know what you're going to get in terms of judges. And the court process is always going to be really brutal, particularly for LGBTQ clients. It's never, I don't think it's worth it for most clients, but particularly for LGBTQ clients, you're not going to get a settlement that's enough better than what you'd get in collaborative or mediation to make it worth the extra trauma of going through a litigation process as an LGBT person. So it's also, for me, because there's a lot of a lot of stuff that isn't recognized technically under the law that I think is important equity for LGBT clients. So for example, taking into account the duration of financial entanglement before the parties were able to get legally married, right? There's no provision for that under the law. And so having to compensate for the ways in which our families are not recognized by law means that working in equity out of court is usually best for clients. And similarly, when there's a trans kid or an LGBTQ kid, I think it's really helpful, as I said earlier, to try to stay out of litigation when possible, because the discourse around trans young people right now is extremely toxic, and I hesitate to put the fate of a client or their child in the hands of a stranger, because the odds vary by county, right? But they're never zero, that you're going to end up with a judge who says the non-affirming parent should have custody because this child is being abused through being given access to gender affirming care. Which leads us to the last thing, which is working with LGBTQ clients in 2025, which is very difficult. You may have already encountered that it's very difficult. And especially for those of us who are lawyers, right? Like the thing that we are supposed to be doing for our jobs is applying a client's facts to a relatively reliable rule of law and being able to give them a prediction about what will happen that we can feel pretty confident in. And that feels kind of impossible right now. And so I think it's important, just as a matter of cultural competency, you may be someone who is or is not personally finding your life affected by the federal administration stuff. It may be true for you to varying degrees. But I think keeping a little bit of an eye on how it's impacting your clients, I think is really helpful. I know that the larger circumstances do tend to impact how people are engaging with conflict in their personal lives. I've certainly noticed that, especially since the inauguration, everybody is kind of just in fight or flight mode all the time. Everybody's really, really escalated. Everybody's really, really freaked out and directing that escalation at each other, when it's really not coming from anything other than the pervasive atmosphere of threat. And so when working with LGBTQ clients, I think it's important to remember that they are coming into your office out of a world that is feeling increasingly scary, and that it's a real gift and an honor to be able to give them a place of recognition and sanctuary and peace within that, to let them know I can't control what's happening in the world out there, but while you are in my office, I will keep you safe. While you are in my office, I will make sure that you are not under threat. It's a real gift and a mitzvah, I think, to be able to do that. And it also impacts the substance of the work because, for example, a lot of other states, other than New York right now, are criminalizing trans healthcare. They're making it illegal. They're making it a crime for a trans person to use the correct bathroom for their gender identity, stuff like that, which, you have to know about that stuff when you're thinking about, what happens if the spouse wants to relocate? What happens if the kid is relocating? What happens if you're trying to split custody between New York and a state where the New York parent legally cannot go? What happens if you are in a situation where the courts of the other state where the child is domiciled, understand the existence of your client by itself to be child abuse. And this is one of the things Florida is doing this right now, where they're saying doing a drag show in a place where there might be a child is a sex crime, and being a trans person existing in public counts as doing a drag show, which means a trans person going to the grocery store is a sex crime because there might be a child there. And so knowing about that stuff in the context of, custody matters, and even just thinking about like the intersection of trans identity and being criminalized, that stuff is going to come up, whether it's in the substance of, are we relocating? Are we dealing with the laws of different states? Or it's just your client comes into your office and it feels like they're being really fighty for no reason. It's not for no reason. It's because of everything that's happening. So I think I'll leave that there and give us a little bit of time to talk through, like, what have you all been seeing? Are, what strategies are you, Barbara says, I believe that the current administration's directives affects all of us as professionals who care, LGBT, trans or not. Absolutely. I mean, I think it affects everybody who would like there to like continue to be a government at all, you know. But I think for people who move through the world in different ways, the specific sensation of how you're being affected is different. Like I know for me, right, like as a Jewish person whose folks came to this country in the last, in the last couple of generations, I'm having a lot of like the ghosts of my great grandparents are screaming in my ears. And I think that, it's not that people who aren't Jewish aren't experiencing impacts, but the impacts are different for people who have different lives and different families and different worlds. So when we are taking care of each other as a community in scary times, I think it's really valuable to understand the ways in which that fear is different for different people.
I just wanted to give the last code for today, and that's practice. Practice is the last code. Ken, did you want to share something? I think you wrote something in the note in the chat.
Go ahead, Ken.
Hey, Andy, how are you?
It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So yeah, a few things. I'll start with the more professional issue. I have cases where children are trans, and it comes up more, I think, in the nature of the parties advising and making sure names are correct in agreements, that kind of thing. So that's number one, because it hasn't really been an issue beyond that. But I think as more and more individuals transition and the like, it's going to become more and more of an issue. Secondly, as some people on the call know, or many people on the call know, I have my older stepchild is trans. And so, he was up a weekend or two ago and with a trans friend. And it's interesting what you said about relationships, because his 3+ year relationship ended recently, as did the relationship of his trans friend. And I'm just curious. On the one hand, I realize you may not know all when it comes to everything trans, but is it more common for relationships to break up? Is it just sort of jumps out at me that my stepson and his friend both had relationships end. Fortunately, my stepson's partner decided to do it by text, which was sort of bizarre.
That's rough.
But
How old is your stepson?
30, 33, 32, soon to be 33.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
that's rough.
so, yeah. And, definitely have discussions about the current situation. I mean, we have an understanding in my household that we're not going to discuss anything, or we're going to discuss as little as possible with regard to the person who occupies the White House, just because we can't live in that atmosphere constantly. But it certainly comes up, and especially with the idiocy that's happening around just using LGBTQ individuals as a prop for his policies, administration, his, the people who believe in him. It's just really sad and pathetic. But you know, it definitely comes up, and there are definitely heightened fears and concerns for my stepson and, you know, his friends. And so it's shocking. And as you allude to, having lost family members in the Holocaust, people that I never knew, but um, just, you know, creating these subcategories of human beings is just really frightening. And so I think that was more of a comment than a question, but I appreciate your patience.
Yeah, I will say, so you asked about relationships ending after 3 years. And I think, you know, I think it might be one of those things, you know, where people will say this about polyamorous relationships as well. They're like polyamorous relationships end. Like, yeah, relationships end. Monogamous relationships end. Cis people break up with their partners. Like it's you want to avoid falling into the trans broken arm syndrome thing, and attribute everything that's happening to the marginalized identity. I think it's pretty normal for a 3-year relationship to end. I think that's an amount of time after which people are like, either we're like doing this, or we're not doing this. Um, but it's also the case, you know, as I've said, like in my own field of vision, right? Like my own community, like everybody's freaking out right now. Like relationship, it's kind of like, do you remember at the beginning of COVID when like everything went freaking bananas, and like my caseload, my like divorce caseload like tripled um like the couple of months after lockdown, because all of a sudden everybody was like stuck in the house together and separated from the rest of their support
Sure.
systems and just losing their minds. It kind of feels like that, where everyone's just like really freaked out, you know, directing that freak out at whoever's closest. Roommate relationships are breaking, like communities are having infighting, like everything's just real, everyone's just like really escalated. And so that may also have played a role in these relationships ending, that everyone's just freaking out. And you know a lot of the time when people feel helpless, they will fight with whoever's closest because it feels like doing something. um and it it it's sad, but like, you know, I always tell clients like 50%, they say 50% of marriages end, right? Like actually 100% of marriages end. Everything ends, like whether it ends through divorce or through someone passing away, like marriages end. But also so do all good meals, right? Just because something is over doesn't mean
Love
that it
that.
wasn't worth doing.
Uh-huh.
And
No,
so
that's
you
great.
had a 3-year relationship and now you are not doing that anymore. That's a fine and normal part of life.
Well, it's certainly, in my mind, more complicated. My stepson was with an individual who identified as non-binary.
Mhm.
And in regard to cases, I have 3 cases right now. One where the client is I, I I don't think this client is necessarily clear exactly where they are, but it's something I have to be sensitive to because I've been given an additional name to potentially refer to the client as.
Mhm.
Another case where one of the children is trans, and another case where I believe both of the children, who are now adults, are trans. And just to leave you with the comment that the father made, the client, he, I was having a conversation with he and his current partner and talking about this larger issue of the assault on trans people. And his response, he's a adjunct professor at Columbia. And so he's in contact with a lot of people, multi-generational. And his comment was, well, you know, when people like me die off, you know, the old white guys, the people who are in their teens and 20s, this is all just part of their life. It's not anything unusual for them. And so once Trump's, you know, most fervent old followers move on, then maybe we can have some greater sanity in the world. But thank you for educating us on all of this and for your patience.
Yeah, when I work with the parents of trans young people, I really love working with affirming parents of trans young people, because it feels very like, it makes me feel very hopeful, because like I grew up in rural New Hampshire, in the early 90s. And I didn't have internet. I didn't have, any community. I had no way of accessing the information that I wasn't the only person like me in the world. Right. So there was no way for my parents to have been affirming, even if they would have been, because I didn't have language. I didn't have connection. I didn't know, I didn't know that trans was something you could be. And so that was the case until I was like 20, and I moved to New York City, because I was like, there's something deeply wrong with me. And I know that no one will ever understand it, right? And that there's no one else like me in the world. I moved to New York City because I had this sense that there might be information there. And then I had to spend a lot of time like unlearning all of the misery of those 20 years where the only thing I knew was there's something wrong with me, right? And when I look at when I look at kids these days who like, they have that community, they have that connection, they have language for their experience. And the first moment that they're like, I wonder if I might be a girl, they can go on the internet and be like, am I a girl? And immediately be connected with millions and millions of other people that feel how they feel, that have language for what they're talking about. And then they go to their parents and they're like, Mom, I think I'm a girl. And their parents are like, cool, let's get your identity documents updated. Let's go shopping. Fuck it. Like, what are we doing? Like, they immediately, like right out the gate, they feel welcome in the world. They feel loved. They are supported. They have what they need. They are not spending 20 years just knowing that there's something like deeply wrong with them the way that we did. And we are about to see that generation of trans young people. We are about to see what happens when they become adults. The world has never seen that. The world has never seen a generation of trans young people that grow up feeling welcome in the world. And we are about to see those kids grow up and take charge. And we have no data points for how powerful they're going to be, right? We have no way of anticipating how much ass they're going to kick. I think it's going to be a lot. Thank you, Ken. I'm glad that your stepson has you. I think that's really special.
Oh, thank you. And just listening to what you just said reminded me, I have one of my hiking friends who happens to be 83. His two youngest grandchildren, they live in Brooklyn, and one of them is, I think, about to turn 13, and one about to turn 16. The 16-year-old is transitioning, but now is confronted with all of these issues that the hospitals are threatened if they provide, transitioning care. And so they've had to call around to doctors and his parents have had to call around to doctors and find doctors who are willing to help in the transition and whatever this young person wants to pursue. So it's incredible the impact. And it might be a small group of individuals, but it's just so upsetting and unacceptable.
Well, I will tell you what, Ken. I'm putting a link in the chat to a package of New York City Council resolutions that includes a proposal by Crystal Hudson requiring the New York City Department of Health to implement WPATH standards of care, which is the best standards of care for trans people, at all New York City hospitals. That is in committee today. That is accepting written testimony on these legislative proposals through, I think, Wednesday at noon. And so if you want to write up a little thing that says, I think that trans young people should have access to care, and submit it to the New York City Council, you might be able to help your friend's grandkid get what they need.
That's great. I'm actually gonna copy the link and send it to my friend, and he'll send it to his son, and I'm sure they will take action.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay, I have a basic cultural competency question that's not
Great.
related to the law, but it feels like a safe place to ask this question. So, one of my friends, her son transitioned from being female to being male. And my question is, we were talking about his bat mitzvah. Is when you talk about trans people's past, when they were a different gender, their first assigned gender, do they prefer to refer to the gender that they were at the time, or kind of rewrite as if they were always the gender that they are now? I mean, I understand inside they maybe were, but like
Yeah.
when she refers to her son's bar mitzvah, which was a bat mitzvah, like what's the right language to use that I think that trans people would prefer, if that
That's a
makes any
really good
sense?
question, Michelle. No, that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, I don't think there's like one right answer. I think this is a question to ask the child. And it might be that, because I know a bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah are like procedurally, they're not that different. But it could be.
Well, that was just an example, but she was struggling herself, and she and her husband are both totally affirming. But we were at a yoga class, and she's talking about her son and stumbling, not knowing how to
Right.
talk
Do you
about it,
say bat
even
mitzvah?
with the absolute best intentions. And it just occurred to me that was a really interesting
It's
linguistic
a
issue.
really good question. I think the best practice would be to sit down with the kid and say, how do you prefer that I do this? Like, do you want me to call it your bar mitzvah? Do you want me to call it your bat mitzvah? Do you want to do another ceremony now and call it your bar mitzvah and say, this is now you are becoming a Jewish man? Do you want to have that moment, where you get to learn Torah as a Jewish man? Like, would that feel good for you?
That's an interesting idea. I was also just more generally like when her child had a different name, right? When she refers to her child in the past, will she always refer to that child by their current name or by the name that they had? Is that also just individual completely?
I would say generally use the current name for everything, just because some people prefer to keep their old name very private, and not like let other people know what it is. It's for some people it's for emotional reasons, and for some people it's practical. Like if someone knows your old name, then they can use your old name and call you by it, and people would rather be called by the name that's correct. And so like for example, I don't really share my old name because I know, like, I don't want people calling me that. I want them to call me Andy because that's the name that I picked. And so I would say generally, even if you're telling a story about something that happened before the child started using this name, use the name that they use now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking. Yes, this is absolutely a safe space for what feels like basic questions. And the reason that I say that is because there are going to be questions that you feel like you want to ask your LGBTQ plus clients, because you're like, I need to know this so that I can give you good services. But you don't want to ask your clients that stuff because of what we talked about earlier, right? That we are not educating ourselves on our clients. The place to bring those questions is to me, because I am being paid money to answer your questions. So this is the exact right place to bring those questions. Anyone else have a question that feels super basic? Yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
Hi, mine is more of a parenting question.
Great.
Very personal because I have a almost 4-year-old. And at this age, I feel like kids are very into naming gender, so in pronouns, it's like, oh, that's my uncle, oh, that's my aunt, everything's very like, boy,
They like to categorize stuff.
yeah, she's totally into, and actually learning the words that, correspond. And on the subway, walking down the street, you know, there are many opportunities. This morning, we're actually on the train. And she's like, "Mommy," you know, she talks loud enough that they could hear us. And they chose not to respond. I wasn't sure how to handle it, but she's like, "Mommy, he has such pretty long nails. Like, I really like his nails, and he kind of looks like a girl, but then I think he's a boy, you know." And I'm like, "Honey," I'm like, she said, is he a boy or is he a girl?" And I said, "You know, honey, I don't know what his gender preference is, or what their gender preference is, but you know, people can be whatever they want to be. We're each unique." You know, and then when we got off the train, I reminded her to try to not talk about people in front of them. So this goes beyond gender preference
Yeah.
conversations. You know, it's just about how people look. But how do you educate people around, you know, just the basic, like, young school age?
Yeah, I think you really nailed it, because there's kind of two things, right? One is we're trying to be polite to people on the train. Like, you also don't want to have your kid being like, "What's on that person's face?" You know? And so, like, what is appropriate to say audibly in public is question number one. And then question number two is, how do you respond to your child saying, "Is this person a boy or a girl?" Question number one, it sounds like you sort of have the sense of that already, that you want to talk about, you know, we don't talk about people, you know, we talk to people, not about them, you know, stuff like that. And then the question of, how do we respond to, is this a boy or a girl? I think you also got really right, because the answer for me, for a child that's 4, is there are so many things that you could be, you know. Boy and girl are 2 of them, but you can be whatever you want. I had this beautiful experience a few years ago of getting to go into a kindergarten class, where the teacher had found that the kids were, like, picking up some kind of nasty stuff from just around, and were, like, gender policing each other and being like, "Boys don't this, girls don't this." And so they asked me to come in and talk to the kids. And the kids asked me, like, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And I said, "Well, the cool thing about being a grown-up is you get to be whatever you want, and no one's allowed to stop you." And so I said, "If you could be whatever you want and no one was allowed to stop you, what would you be?" And the kid that I asked specifically said, "I would be a bus." And I was like, "Great, let's be buses." And then everyone, you know, was running around yelling beep, beep. So I think, you know, kids at the base of it are in this really beautiful place where, like, they're not already stuck in the constrictions of how we're taught to think about gender. So you have the opportunity to put expansiveness into their understanding of it. That's a lot harder to do for an adult. And so the question of is this a boy or a girl is a really beautiful opportunity to inject that expansiveness into the conversation. And it sounds like that's exactly what you did. So great job.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like what I said satisfied her. And I do feel like she's completely open, and I want her to remain that way. I was actually more concerned about, you know, as we left the train, I was concerned about the adult that was sitting there overhearing. You know, I just wanted to be sensitive, and also, you know, make my child feel comfortable too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like there's the possibility that you could have engaged with the adult and you know, and opened a conversation and said, like, "My child likes your nails. Can you tell me and my child, like, what pronouns to use when saying that we like your nails?" But you know, I know talking to each other on the subway is a dicey thing.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Meg.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This is a slightly different question also. I'm a psychologist actually, and I had worked for at a college, Purchase College, where there were a lot of trans students. And you know, it's interesting what you were saying about like, don't use people to sort of learn off of them. And I have a slightly different way of looking at this, not as a divorce professional, but in my capacity, I always found it really helpful to sort of just say out loud, like, I might make mistakes and I would appreciate you correcting me. And, you know, I don't know everything, because I think that's real. You know, if you're a cisgender person and you don't have a lot of experience, I think it's okay to say to people, like, I really respect you, but I may get some stuff wrong, and I just hope that you're okay with that and you'll let me know.
I'm gonna redirect that a little bit, because I find that any sentence that starts, I really respect you, but the first half of that sentence is a little dicey, right? So I would say being thoughtful about not just, I'm asking you to fix my
Yeah,
practices for me, but taking the initiative to like come to sessions like this, like really learn about what it takes to be culturally competent, but also like nobody expects perfect,
right.
perfection from anybody, and so I think, when you say I don't have a lot of experience, and so I have to flag that I don't have a lot of experience, like doing stuff like this, like what you're doing today, is a way of getting more experience and getting more practice at being, being trustworthy for your trans and gender nonconforming clients. And so, I think I understand the urge to say I might screw up, and you have to just understand that. But I would invite you to instead, think about how you can do that in a way that is pointing at the needs of your client, and not at the needs of the practitioner.
Well, it's interesting because I always felt like people responded pretty well to that, like honesty and transparency on my part. So I understand what you're saying. I think it's also, it's sort of like if you're dealing with people, I mean, I think this is across the border, like across the spectrum, you don't always you don't know everything about everybody because of the complexity of who people are. And I think being transparent about that sometimes actually helps people feel better, rather than you coming in as like, I get it. I already know everything there is to know about your experience or something. Anyway,
Honestly, when a professional says to me, I might screw up, I'm like, you don't have to tell me that. I know that. Go ahead,
okay.
Jessica.
Oh, hi, I'm so sorry that I missed.
Hi, I'm so happy to see you.
I was leading a training, otherwise I would have been here. Hello, hello. I just want to say, I think this is a really interesting point, and I think what I'm hearing from Andy is a little like the proof is in the pudding, kind of like why it's almost like taking it outside of gender or anything. It's sort of like when you say like this is a safe space. It's like who you don't say that, like make a safe space. Make sure
Right.
that it's a safe space, right? Your words are so I think there's just a nuance. I don't think you're offending anybody, Meg, by saying like this is new to me or whatever. And please, but I also think some people might not respond well to you misgendering them. And that's about them. And we can't, and you can ask for grace, and some people might be like, whatever, I don't care, that's cool. And somebody else might be having a bad day or might just not be very, not
Not
wanting.
have a lot of flexibility on that. Yeah.
Exactly. And we can't control how people, react. So I think it's more about just making sure that we, as humans are just, showing up. But anyway, thank you.
When it comes to like in my initial conversations with divorce clients, I always tell them, like, I know that I am asking you for a lot of trust right off the bat, and we are only just meeting each other. And so you have no reason to trust me. You don't know me. And so I'm asking you to tell me all of this like really painful stuff and being really vulnerable with me when there's no reason that you would think this is safe for that. So to the extent that you're able to do that, I always tell them, I want to thank you for this advance of trust, and I'm going to do everything I can to live up to it and to earn it, you know, as we move through our professional relationship. And I think that's a way of saying, I think, a similar thing, Meg, to what you were talking about, that like, I am asking you to trust me. I know you have no reason to trust me. And I'm going to do my best to live up to that trust. That's a way of saying, you know, obviously none of us are perfect in our praxis. You know, we're all people. Oh, hello, Doug. We're all people who are doing our best. And all we can try to do is extend trust to each other and try to live up to the trust that is extended to us. We're starting to come in for a landing for today. Anyone else have any burning questions on their minds?
Andy, is there any books that you recommend that would be helpful?
Yeah, books about any particular thing.
Just about how just to get more competency, and with language and with just just to make it so that we have a safer space, that we feel like prepared, and that we don't screw up.
Yeah, so hold on one second, my bookshelf is right behind me.
Yeah. And while we'll wait for Andy, just wanted to close out. Thanks, Andy.
So one book that I've found really, really helpful is hold on. Martha Ertman's book, Love's Promises.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's a really beautiful book about family agreements and different kinds of families, and considerations for different kinds of families. I found it a great read.
Can you spell the last name, Andy? I'm sorry. How's
Ertman, Martha Ertman.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
All right.
I think that there is a book that came out recently that's like a transgender family law, like hornbook, basically. Yeah, Jennifer Levi and Elizabeth Monin-Browder. I'll put that in here as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I wanted to thank you. This has been such a great presentation. Thank you for your time and your guidance, your expertise. This has been really wonderful. And thank you, Catherine, for helping to facilitate this. Really appreciate it. To our attendees, please fill out the evaluation and CE credit form as explained in today's email. The CLE COAs will be sent as an inclusive email when you print it off versus a PDF. And then materials, which Andy has been just so gracious in providing, will be available to all the attendees. And I believe it's also going to be posted on the members only site, as well as a recording. There's been a permission to record. So if you missed anything, Jessica, you're able to kind of watch it, and because this was just really terrific. I know I'll be watching it again too.
Thank you, Melissa.
Please watch your email for the and check the calendar for dates for our fall schedule. We have the virtual pods, support group meetings, as well as collaborative connection lunches. And I think we're also putting the codes again. All the codes are in the chat, by the way, for the CLE. So thanks again for taking the time to join us today. Catherine, did you want to share anything before we sign off?
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yes, I wanted to say thank you so much, Andy. Always wonderful to have you with us. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to point out, or maybe you could say a word on the Chosen Family Law Center and the incredible advocacy work you're doing. I don't know if everyone here is well aware of what you and Diana are doing out there in the world to help so many people.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so our organization is putting our website on here. Okay, Larry. Our organization is the Chosen Family Law Center, and We do direct services and legislative and policy advocacy for people who live in families other than the heterosexual nuclear model. So we provide pro bono representation in things like wills and advance directives, prenups, postnups, no-nups, gamete donor agreements, second parent adoptions and orders of parentage, and also name and gender marker changes for people all over the state. Ken, I'm not in Beacon. I live about 45 minutes north of Beacon. I'm near Kingston. But I do like Beacon very much. And so we do have a really fun annual gala. We usually have it at our friend Andrew's house, which is the house that Emma Lazarus, the person who wrote the I lift my lamp beside the golden door
Oh,
poem.
wow.
Yeah, it was her
Wow.
house
Wow.
on 12th Street. It's gorgeous. He's got like a 2-story library with a Beauty and the Beast style library ladder that he will not let me Beauty and the Beast on.
When is the gala?
It's in November.
Okay.
So if you go on the link that I just put in the chat, there's a place to sign up for our newsletter. If you'd like to find out about the gala when it's happening. We also do a pride party that's not quite as fancy, but is very fabulous. That's in June, of course, usually at the House of Yes in Brooklyn. That's always really fun.
Yeah, Melissa, there's a group of us who go to the gala every year, so we'd love to have more of our colleagues join us.
Oh, I'm
That would be
definitely,
lovely.
Yeah,
I'm
Jessica and
definitely
I
gonna-
and Barbara and Bob and
Wow.
a group of us.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah, it's always it's really the highlight of my social season for sure.
Okay. All right. So I
Well,
think
it's so nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming out. It really means a lot to me that so many of my colleagues are interested and have decided to take some of their Friday to make sure that they can give good services to my community and my family.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.